Welcome to Wellness Wednesdays. I am so glad that you all are here to join us. I'm Dr. Thema Bryant-Davis, candidate for president-elect of the American Psychological Association. And this has been an exciting series we have been running this summer, initially on Instagram and now on Facebook and YouTube. If you have missed any, I encourage you to look at the prior recordings through our website, themaforapa.com. And on today, I am excited to have my colleague and friend here who has been a wonderful leader in the field of psychology, Dr. Doug Haldeman, who's a professor and chair doctoral program in clinical psychology at John F. Kennedy University, a fellow of Division 17, 20, 29, 31, 42, 44, and 56, and a member of Divisions 35, 45, and 51. Doug, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Really a pleasure to be here.
Oh, I am so glad that you're here with us as well, and for such an important topic as we look at LGBTQ plus psychology. And I want to start with kind of getting your sense of where we are as a field in terms of educating ourselves and future psychologists on LGBTQ plus issues in psychology and how we can do a better job. What is your sense?
Well, it was about 35 years ago that I gave my first talk as a guest lecturer at the internship program at the University of Washington. And at that time, a couple of people in that first class came up to me and said, you're the first openly gay person that I've ever met. And at that time, this was a very sort of unique, specialized, standalone area. And boy, have things ever changed. Things have changed. We have now seen that there is so much infusion of LGBTQ issues along with other diversity issues throughout curricula in higher education. There are actual degree programs now that many universities sponsor, at least degrees or certificates in queer studies. And so we have really come a long way. And why is that? I would say two related factors. Number one, much greater visibility in our social world. If we think back to 30 years ago, what a rarity it was to see queer characters in media representations, especially accurate ones that were not stigmatizing or pathologizing. And of course, all you have to do is just go outside your house any June in these days, and you're going to see pride flags in many places. And our visibility is one factor. A related factor is we have such better research than we used to. When I started working in this area, scholarly, writing my first research articles about conversion therapy, our research was pretty much limited to convenience samples of largely white cisgender gay men. And of course, first of all, convenience samples are nowhere near as reliable as just population-based data. But secondly, that element is such a narrow piece of our entire community. And so now we have studies that are much more reflective of who we are in terms of race and ethnicity, age, and particularly gender identity. And the other place I would say is such a positive now is that we have really in our community seen pretty quickly over the last few years or 10 years, maybe a dismantling of the gender binary paradigm, so that now we see gender as a much more fluid construct. And as a result, we have a much better understanding of the issues that are very often brought forth by non-binary or particularly trans-identified folks. And of course, all of that has led to better institutional policies, better protections for queer students and faculty in higher education. And all of this results in a very changed landscape, so that now we have um, LGBTQ specific models for psychotherapy research, for example, and making recommendations about treatment. And so all of that, I think, is is very, very positive in terms of our evolution of how we understand better. And this kind of culminates in APA policy itself.
Mm.
All psychologists, I would love it if they were familiar with the two policies that were passed by APA Council this past February on conversion therapy for sexual orientation and for gender identity, because these policies really are accompanied by a compendium of the most up-to-date recent research in this area. However,
Yeah.
we still have a ways to go. Let's face it,
Mhm.
we still have a
Mhm.
ways to go, because there is no uniformity, really, I don't think, to the way queer studies are taught, or through whose lens is it taught.
Mm. Yes.
Variably, those of us with the lived experience are going to see it through the lens that we have lived. And there is so much more that we really need to consider. And what issues aren't resolved also connect to how we combat the backlash that
Mm.
occurs across the board, not just in education and training, but in social policy and everything else. So we've got a ways to go. We've
Yeah.
got a ways to go.
Oh, I so appreciate you walking us through it from your lived experience to APA policy. And can you say briefly, in terms of the policy that was just passed this year related to conversion therapy, what it states?
What it states basically is that we are able, I think, for the first time, to rely on population-based research that enables us to say conversion therapy is harmful.
Yes.
It, especially among youth, increases the likelihood of suicidality, suicide attempts by as much as threefold when kids are obliged to go into conversion therapy. And that's why it is important that we have these kinds of policies to take to state legislatures and
Mhm.
say, okay, 20 states and the District of Columbia are banning these dangerous practices. So how about
Yeah.
the other 30 now? We've got
Yes.
we've got work to do. And fortunately, the Trevor Project, which is a suicide prevention project based in Los Angeles, has a 50 bills in 50 states program going to advance that, because that's not just important for um, the standpoint of regulating the profession, but also from informing the public.
Right.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Thank you for that. One
yeah.
of the things I've been reflecting on in this campaign season is the importance of continuity. And
Mm.
I'm so glad one of the current priorities is around health disparities. And I wonder if you could speak to some of the health disparities facing queer youth as well as adults.
Certainly. Well, the research pretty clearly indicates that overall, LGBTQ people are significantly much more likely to experience generally poorer physical and mental health outcomes than their heterosexual counterparts. This takes place, of course, really across the board in terms of cardiac issues, as well as those diseases that are sexually transmitted, all manner of illnesses and syndromes that are directly related to behavioral issues like smoking, uh, drinking, drug use, that sort of thing. And of course, it was long regarded that we as a community generally suffer significantly more from depression and anxiety than our heterosexual counterparts. Why? Well, I think it's pretty obvious at this point and has been well established, is because of the internalization of minority stress. and
Yeah.
particularly with regard to youth who are much more likely to be susceptible to poor mental health outcomes when A, they are being bullied either in person or in cyber, online bullying. And I realize that's not exclusive to just queer kids. However, they are 3 times more likely to report that they are being targeted than their heterosexual counterparts. And this, of course, connects directly to poor mental health uh, uh, issues. And when we talk about health disparities for youth in particular, I think we need to put our focus on trans kids and non-binary kids, and those kids whose gender presentation is atypical, because they tend to be the ones who are showing the greatest difficulty with regard to mental health issues, but also with regard to adequate access to medical care. Um, yeah, we look at our profession, I think, as being somewhat ahead of medicine at this point, because not all medical schools have training components that advise physicians in training about what are typical issues presented by trans identified individuals. So, those are some of the issues that we consider when we're talking about health disparities.
Yeah, thank you so much. It is critical, and as you raise it, I think about the importance of integrating LGBTQ issues across our various courses, right? Like with race and ethnicity, not just sticking it in the multicultural class, but when we're talking about health psychology, when we're talking about clinical practice and interventions. And I also, want to raise the importance of us looking at intersectionality. And for those who are
Mm.
listening who may be less familiar, it's when people are members of multiple marginalized groups. And I'm wondering in particular about persons who are both LGBTQ and persons of color, and some of what you see around holding both of those spaces.
That is really, really important question. I reflect on. I mean, at the time I was in full time clinical practice in Seattle. At that time, there were no openly Black gay male psychologists around,
Mm,
and so I did have a number of young African American and Latino men in my practice. And I remember one time, one of my patients said to me, in reference to the racism that he was experiencing in the queer community and the
mhm,
rejection that he was experiencing from his conservative religious family in the South, in
yeah,
Mississippi. He said, I'm trying to straddle two worlds and I don't feel like I've got a place in either one. I don't have a home. And those words, there are sometimes someone will say something to just pierce
mhm,
your heart
yeah,
because you think, how do we create space?
yes.
As far as I'm concerned, one of the most traumatic things, especially that a young person can go through in the coming out process, is rejection from their family. And yet we know that, especially many young people, and especially from coming from communities of color, may be susceptible to family rejection, religious grounds, or whatever, social grounds, whatever you want to call it. And so we need to create space, safe space in our communities in the LGBTQ area so that they can create homes, so that they can create a chosen family. Because if there's one protective factor in the uh, multiplicity of issues that especially younger queer people face, like the incidence of hate crimes or simply of prejudice and discrimination in housing and employment, it still exists.
Mhm,
Hate crimes are up last year, according to the FBI, significantly. We represent the third greatest category of hate crimes after race and ethnicity and religion. Then come sexual orientation and gender identity. And there's something that tells me hate crimes against our community are underreported because people are ashamed or people are not out and cannot report these sorts of things. Anyway, all that's by way of saying that when we think about how we look at what are the best factors that protect people in our communities, it is through the ability to have a chosen family and to have social support. And that's where intersectionality comes in. Too long. I mean, and think about the irony of it. This is a movement for liberation that was started by who? Queer trans women of color. You had them down in LA, Thema, fighting back against the cops at the donut shop. And then up here in San Francisco, same thing, queer women of color. And then let's talk about Stonewall.
Just, I want to make it explicit for those who aren't catching. He's talking about Black Lives Matter, right? That those who started that movement are queer women of color. Yes.
Absolutely. And that is why, these days when we have this discussion about, well, our history at Stonewall, who started Stonewall?
Right.
Two queer women of color who were trans women. And then because of white privilege and economic power, it was the white cisgender gay men who took it all over and acted like we created the whole thing. Well, we've got some reparations to make, is what I would say to my fellow white, older, cisgender gay men. We've got some repair work to do here. And the way that we do it is by acknowledging the intersections of everyone in our community and the racism that our brethren and sisters of color experience is something that starts at home, and we need to address it, and we need to do that courageously.
Yes, yes, I love that. It's so important, as you say, courageously to address these ruptures, as opposed to sometimes we just want to skip over them and, call for unity and let's just move together, but needing to acknowledge those erasures and the impact of that, and the corrective work, like how are we going to do it differently moving forward, and that humility.
That's right. We have reparations to make, and I absolutely encourage all of us to roll up our sleeves and participate very actively, whoever you are and wherever you are, on the local level, the interpersonal level. Think about your workplace. Think about how we relate to our neighbors, the people in our social circles. How welcoming are we? And it goes all the way to the international level too. I just got back a couple days ago from a very, very wonderful experience at the World Pride celebrations in Copenhagen, in Denmark.
Beautiful.
And the Euro Games, where I absolutely ran in the old man division, killed it.
Excellent.
One of the things that I think is true of queer psychology, that's true of American psychology in general, is sort of how what's the right word? How ethnocentrically focused we are, or how we focus on the U.S. That's fine. That's important. But there's a whole world out there.
That's right. Thank you.
There is a whole world out there. And when I think about the diaspora of 4.1 million people, fleeing their homelands primarily in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa because of violence and discrimination. And if we extrapolate and say, well, 10% of those might be queer, I would have to say, I bet it's a little bit higher than that. But still, we're looking at about 500,000 people. This is a humanitarian relief crisis. I listen to the stories of the people that I work with in designing mental health programs for queer immigrants and refugees around the world, and I think there is something that we have to do, all of us, whatever privilege we hold, to use it for the better, because there is a big crisis going on outside of our own borders that we really need to attend to. I listened to the story of just one man, for example, from Uganda, who had married his husband from a different African country, Burundi, in South Africa. He was living with his adult siblings, 5 adult siblings, including a twin brother and the single mother who raised them. And after he got back, apparently it became known about the wedding. And Uganda doesn't have a formal law about putting same-sex behaving people to death, although they did debate it strongly, but they don't need to, because there are vigilantes that are socially supported in that country who came into the home one night and beat him unconscious, did not kill him. But when he woke up, he found that all of his siblings had been slaughtered and his mother had been decapitated.
Oh my goodness.
These are unimaginable stories. He awoke on the floor next to her head, which had been severed from her body. And still, he lived to tell the story about immigrating to Sweden, and what it is like now living for him in a country. And it pains me to say this, because this is where my family comes from. I have gone there every year to do some work with refugees, but in concept, diversity was absolutely of a value of Swedish society. Now, in practice, that the society is actually becoming more diverse, there is some backlash, including from an increasingly repressive government, that makes it more difficult for, especially for queer immigrants of color, to remain in the country. And this man cannot bring his husband to join him until the husband can find a job and prove that he can speak Swedish. Well, who's going to learn that
Oh, wow.
outside of the country? And that's just one example. And I
Yes.
was actually able to speak to one of the conference organizers afterward, and I said, "What's happening? What's happening to this country?" And he said, "Well, it is simply a conservative backlash, even here." So that's kind of a bit of a tangent, but that is just
No, I'm glad you raised it. This is international psychology, global psychology, and we do have to get beyond, kind of, as you said, this kind of narrow view of what our focus area is. That we have people who are doing this work all over the globe, who live it all over the globe, and so to be tuned into those realities that you're naming. And I go back to that initial quote you said about trying to find your home, right? Which is the place where I will be safe and accepted and supported.
Right, right.
Mm-hmm. Well, several times you mentioned protective factors, and I want to go to that now, thinking about the strengths that you observe in the LGBT community, coping strategies, or some people talk about resistance or advocacy strategies that are helpful as we're talking about the realities of the discrimination, bias, and oppression based in both around sexuality and around gender identity.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question, because I mean, I have found in our community, it is so easy to identify all the problems and identify all the pain points in our personal lives and in the larger, if you will, systemically racist culture that we live in. But there are, in fact, I think some opportunities as well, in terms of resilience and protective factors. And I actually kind of see it on 3 different levels, sort of the internal, the immediate social world, and then the larger socio-political context. So let me just talk about those 3 things really, really briefly.
Sure.
I think Years ago, I was in a consultation group and I was using this term, the gay spirit. And one of my colleagues, straight colleagues, turned to me and said, "What do you mean by that?" And I thought for a moment, yeah, what do I mean by that? Because I had sort of conceptualized this term without actually talking it through. And I think what I mean by that is that when you are growing up in a world that teaches you you are not the way you're supposed to be, there becomes a layer of fear, of suspicion, tremendous anxiety that kind of keeps you uh, internally focused on yourself. How do I get through this? How do I manage and navigate the disparity between who I experience myself to be and what is expected of me? Through that process, I want to say, I believe, and this isn't based on anything other than just my own clinical and lived experience over all these almost 70 years now, is is it helps you build something inside, whether it is your own sense of spirituality and or your sense of humor and or your ability to hang on to whatever shreds of optimism that you have that become clearer as you are able to live your authentic self. Something happens on an internal level for us that oppression doesn't kill us. I mean, I hate this old cliche about what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but I believe that if we are attuned to our inner strength and wisdom, we are much more able to manifest a sense of confidence in who we are and a sense of I don't know what else to call it, other than sort of a spiritual essence that carries you through difficult times. Now, there's another layer, though, here, which is who's in your immediate social environment? What kind of support do you get? Because, as you know, that question about what are the best protective factors, I can really say in two words: social support is probably most key. It is certainly most key for youth, but that's true throughout the uh, the generations or the lifespan of a queer life. At the end of our lives or toward the end of our lives, older LGBTQ people are frequently isolated or alone or depressed or maybe they've had chronic rejection from their families. It is imperative that we develop and maintain a social network of support, a family of choice, if you will, hopefully in addition to your family of origin and your culture of origin. But family of choice is so important, and particularly I think at both ends of the age spectrum, but of course in between too. If you don't feel like you have a home in your family of origin or community of culture, absolutely, we have to work to create them in the context of our queer community. Third, however, is this greater, I don't know, level, I guess, or sphere that we could talk about in terms of this model, and that has to do with the socio-political realities of our time. As I said earlier, we've got better research, we're more visible now, but there's also a lot of backlash going on at the present time against the trans community in particular. Well, we're just seeing a lot of backlash in general, aren't we? Let's talk about voter suppression.
Right, that's right.
For one thing, let's talk about, if we can't beat them fair and square, let's change the rules of the game to advantage ourselves. That's kind of a general phenomenon that we're seeing right now. And a part of that has to do with anti-trans legislation that is intended to limit the gender expression of trans and non-binary people. So advocacy and activism, to whatever level and degree a person feels safe doing that, is very, very important. Right now in San Francisco, we're having this big debate about, of all things, the rainbow flag, which since its original design by Gildan 78 has flown in a huge form at Harvey Milk Plaza, which is at the corner of Market and Castro Streets. And there has been a move to replace the rainbow flag with the progress flag, which is which is essentially the rainbow flag, but with a chevron on the left. Maybe you've seen it, that have black, brown stripes to indicate people of color in our community, as well as the trans stripes of baby blue and light pink. To me, there's no question. That's to me in no question that if the flag needs to be changed to represent all of us, the entirety of our community, why is that even a discussion? Well, there are those who would say, oh no, wait a minute, the rainbow represents everybody. Well, no, it doesn't. If those that it purports to represent say, I don't feel represented.
Right.
There is nothing easier that we could do than just say, let's put up a flag that reflects all of who we are and serve not only to embrace everyone in our community, but also to remind those of us who have sort of held power for all these years, we make room for others, just as we expected the world to make room for us in the 70s. And everything that we've been through, the health crisis, and now another health crisis.
That's right.
The racism pandemic, all of this stuff. And guess what? We're still here, and we are thriving, and we are growing. But we cannot reflect that growth adequately if we don't reflect in our cultural symbols all that we are.
Beautiful. So important. So important. And I appreciate you naming, the challenges from within and outside, right? So the backlash from those who don't want it, and from those within the movement not wanting to change, right? Or not wanting to hear the concerns of those who have, been silenced or overlooked. And I just really appreciate the holding of both realities, the thriving and the challenge, right? That we have a lot of work to do, and it is stressful, and it does have, these damaging impacts. And, there is, as you say, this spirit, this vivaciousness, this resilience, and the contributions to our larger culture and society that have often been unacknowledged, right? That if we only name the hardships and not recognize, like in every field, in every discipline, including psychology, that there have been key contributions made, that we wouldn't be where we are as a society or as a field without the work of queer people in general and queer psychologists.
Oh, absolutely. Our contributions have been significant, but that doesn't mean that we can, necessarily just be comfortable with who we are and where we've always been. I mean, there are still groups within our community that continue to be marginalized. Let's talk about ability status. Let's talk about the intersection of queerness and ability status, because that is a conversation that has really not been given a lot of voice. Or what about ageism? I mean, I hear so many people in my own age cohort saying, gee, is it I feel so invisible, or is it age appropriate for me to wear a tank top? And I think age appropriate, listen to yourself. These are stigmatizing, ageist kinds of words that we just sort of recite automatically. And so, just getting conscious, breaking it down and being conscious, that's important, I think.
Oh, I'm so glad you named that, because there are these both scripts that internalization that happens, and also as you're naming the unaddressed issues. I remember when I was teaching the human sexuality course and talking about the experience for gay men who use wheelchairs, and one of the members in the class was sharing his experience of, going to a club and that people were affirming, like, good for you, like, glad you're here, but then never being chosen, right? And so what it means with like that tokenism of like, yeah, glad you're present, but are you really included or embraced? And so,
Exactly. Yeah. And I guess what constitutes real inclusion? This event that I went to last couple of weeks in Scandinavia, the World Pride theme was "You are included." And I remember going to one, and I went with my best friend from childhood, who's also gay, and we're almost 60 years going into friendship. He's just a great guy, fun fellow. And so there are all these, dances at night in the streets, and I felt like I was 25 again. And so we're chatting, but at one point I looked around and I said, I feel like the gay grandpa in here because everybody looks like they're in their 20s. And he looked at me and he said, Doug, what do you think you are included means? That means we're included too because of our age. And I think, I've got my own, we all have our own internal stuff to deal with. My ageism, and maybe it's big upcoming birthday. I don't know. But I got to say that being able to enables you then to reach out in different ways so that you're not just giving lip service to inclusion, but actually walking the walk of inclusion.
That's right. That's right. And speaking of walking the walk, I want to ask you about recommended resources for those who want to learn more, whether favorite books or documentaries or anything you would like to recommend.
Oh gosh. Let's see, how much time do we have left? It all depends on who it is seeking the information. I mean, I'm going to comment primarily, I guess, toward professionals who would like to enhance their own self-teaching about queer issues. As I mentioned earlier, the two recent APA policies that have passed are a great way to look at the most recent science of all aspects of sexual orientation and gender identity, because they reference everything from stigma to helpful therapeutic interventions, etc. Because we want to say, okay, if it's not conversion therapy, then what is it for someone who is voicing distress over their own sexual orientation and or their own gender identity. However, there are lots and lots of resources out there. First of all, let me talk about what I think some of the primary ones are for clinicians. Division 17 has every 10 years or so put out a handbook on counseling lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals. It is a big APA tome, but I'm telling you, it's an absolute treasure trove of information that is practical, connecting science and practice. That's great. The other big compendium that came out last year is the Oxford Book of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Mental Health, edited by Esther Rothblum from San Diego State. And that is an absolutely fantastic. It's like an encyclopedia, but for people really interested in the issues, those are good. For something that's a little shorter, maybe more accessible, and in terms of clinical material, I would really recommend the Clinician's Guide. Let me make sure I get the title right. To uh, Gender affirming care for, and this is specifically for work with trans and non-binary clients. It was published 2 years ago by two really preeminent scholars in the field of trans psychology, Annalise Singh from Tulane University and Laura Dickey from Northern Arizona University. And then a general look by Joe Court is called LGBTQ Clients in Therapy, Clinical and Practical Issues. Let's see, what else do we have? I think that for individuals, there are a number of compendia, if you will, of coming out stories that sometimes people find useful and helpful because you realize, wow, I'm not alone. And oh, by the way, going back to what I said earlier about social support, I frequently get the question of like, great, but what if you live in the middle of Wyoming, or what if you are not out or whatever? Well, there are lots of online groups, many through Facebook, for example, where people and there are a lot of them that are targeted to age cohort, like younger queer people, middle-aged, and senior queer folks that are very often forums for discussion. Now, again, it's an online forum, but it does provide people a sense of connection wherever you are, and all of that. There are a couple of books that I think are particularly useful for families. One of them, and I forgot the author's name, sorry, but I've been using it so much. It's called Coming Out, Coming Home, which enables families with a queer son, daughter, or binary person to help understand how to navigate that integration of them into the family system. One book that I really, really like uh, 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 for young gay men of color, young African American gay men, but really for anybody who really wants to get some familiarity with that experience, is um, adapted from the title of an old work by, I think it was Nzotake Shinge, for colored girls.
Oh, Intozake,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. This is called For Colored Boys Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, it is good. I presume he got
Mhm.
permission from her to kind of paraphrase her own.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And Queer Brown Voices is a compendium of Latinx queer individuals, and that is edited by Quesada Gomez and Vidal Ortiz. Finally, there is, the whole question of conversion therapy is still very much in the news and of controversy in our professions. There are a couple of films, one of which is a documentary on Netflix that recently came out in the last month or so, called Pray Away, which is a documentary story about ex-gay religious groups, as well as the film that was out a couple of years ago with Nicole Kidman and Lucas. I can't remember his last name now, but he was the boy in it, called Boy Erased, which takes you through a conversion therapy camp program. And if I can shamelessly put in a plug for my own book,
Yes.
it's out. It will be out by APA Books in November this year, called The Case Against Conversion Therapy. It's an edited volume and the first actual summary of research in the area of conversion therapy to appear for the last 25 plus years, and the first ever of gender identity therapy attempt. So there's all that.
Wonderful. And first, congratulations on the book. And that is exciting and much needed, right? It's not already there. So thank you for being willing to do that labor of love.
Well,
And thank you for the range of resources.
yeah, and there are clearly more. Please, anyone who's listening to this, feel free to email me for other sources or suggestions. I'm easy to reach at Doug Haldeman, just one name, at AOL.com.
Wonderful. Well, I am so grateful, and I know that our audience has been enriched. And the wonderful thing is, we have both those who could attend live, but also those who will catch our recording. And so I want to say thank you again for being willing to do this and have this conversation. It really was valuable on so many levels. So thank you.
Well, Thema, well, yeah, I know you know how I feel about you anyway, but the thanks go to you for your vision in the quest for the presidency of APA. I mean, I think one of the reasons I believe so strongly in your candidacy is that this is the kind of thing you do. You include people. I can't ever remember a time where a candidate for APA president has asked me anything about queer issues, and I know that you are doing this to include everyone in unity in psychology. I mean, it's one thing to talk about it, it is another thing to do it. So thank you for running, and we are with you all the way.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And for those who are watching, I hope you will also share with your colleagues and continue with us. We'll probably have 2 or 3 more in this series before our time is done. Thank you so much, and you all take care.
Thank you, Thema. And thanks, Earl, for the backstage management of this. He's been out of sight, but he is doing the technology part. So thank you.
Yes, so grateful. Dr. Earl Turner, our
Yeah.
behind the scenes psychology technician.
All right. Thanks again.